If this show was a professional show, it would have sponsorship, and this would be a perfect moment to be sponsored by a bucket shop. Alas, it's sponsored by Jeff Snyder's Twitter account at Jeff Snyder _AIP. Jeff, let's move on to our next article, and it's called Transitory the Other Way. You wrote it on July 14th. It's at Alhambra Investments. Let's start with 3 consecutive months of falling core inflation as measured by the Consumer Price Index. Is that unusual?
Unusual, yeah. It's never happened before. So yeah, I think it's the very definition of unusual. No, I mean, you can have all sorts of discussions about inflation, CPI, PC deflator, and all those kinds of things. And, you know, in some ways, it's like taking the average of a phone book. It's somewhat meaningless. I mean, people have a lot of problems with this. Is that really measuring consumer prices? Is it representative of the actual urban consumer and all this stuff? But when you look at especially the core CPI, where I think it's valuable is that when it has these hiccups always correspond with things like recession, especially the worst recessions. So whatever you think about the CPI as a tool of measuring inflation, it does seem to correlate and give you a signal for some of the worst circumstances. Therefore, maybe it's something you pay attention to, especially on the downside. We can argue about the upside and inflation, all that, what it leaves out or what it doesn't include, and hedonics and all those other kinds of adjustments. But on the downside, in these situations, a negative month in the core CPI, which strips out the volatile food and energy prices, in the core CPI, when you see it fall on a monthly basis, that's usually not a good sign in any single month. Now, you see it 2 times in a row. That had only happened once before, and that was in 1981 or 82, at the end of what was at the time the worst recession we had experienced up until since the Great Depression, up until the early 80s, until we got to the Great Recession. Even in the Great Recession, 2008, 2009, the core CPI never declined in 2 consecutive months. In fact, the worst decline for it came in 2000. I think it was late 2009, closer to 2010 at the bottom of the labor market. That's really what we're talking about here. The CPI is related closely to real conditions in the labor market. I'm not going to get into the Phillips curve or any of that stuff yet. But what the main message here is that when you have a monthly decline in the core CPI, that's something you need to pay attention to because it corresponds with some really bad stuff. 2 months in a row had never happened before except for 1982. 3 months in a row was simply unprecedented.
So you mentioned that core CPI, when most people hear about inflation and that we're excluding energy and food, I think most people are repelled by that. Is it because I guess that's what the common person experiences and that's what they think of inflation? Is it that economists are not commoners? Is it that they can't be killed, that they're 7 feet tall, that they drink blood? Or is it something more prosaic, that they're just trying to measure monetary inflation? That's what they're really after. And we think that they care about our kind of inflation.
Yeah, well, there's definitely a divergence in perception because what we perceive of inflation is usually food and energy, right? The most common things that we do all the time. You go to the grocery store, you fill up your car. Those are the most basic kinds of consumer behaviors that we noticed. And a lot of times, we'll skip oil prices for now, but in the food areas, there's this definite divergence between perception and what the numbers say, because food prices have been rising far more rapidly than the CPI, along with other things like education and healthcare, medicines, these other things. So we tend to notice that. We tend to notice that the prices of our basic stuff that we pay attention to are going up. And so we think, well, how can the CPI be so low? Because we don't pay attention to the other stuff that may be going down in price. And when we're talking about monetary inflation, what we really mean is all of those things together, a general trend in consumer prices that is upward, where everything goes up because there's too much money chasing too few goods. That's the old adage about inflation, was too much money chasing not enough goods, or however you want to phrase it. So if that's what we see in the consumer price index, you would see not only food and medicine and education prices rise, you would also see the price of computers, things that are going down, telephones, telecommunications, things that have gotten cheaper over the last 11 years, they would be going up too, because money would be competing with those things and that would drive up the price, consumer pricing power in the hands of corporations, like we saw during the Great Inflation, where not only food prices went up, but the prices on things that had been declining in the 1960s, suddenly they went up too. So it's a general rise in prices that tells us about monetary inflation. And as I said before, when we see something like the core CPI go backward, that tells us that there's a somewhat of a deflationary impulse underneath the economy, including, in those particular months where the CPI was falling, food prices were rising rather rapidly, weren't they? So again, there's definitely a divergence, and it's a valid argument. But from my perspective, if we look at these other times where the CPI does correlate, especially with deep recessions, that's what we need to be focused on right now.
And then you did mention that the all-in CPI, you mentioned that in your article, and that it increased by just 0.65% year over year. So if you do factor everything in, that's not very much. And it was really just the oil market that you're saying that it went up, and it wasn't the greatest flood since Noah of monetary liquidity.
Yeah, remember, we're talking about June 2020 here, right? So we're now talking about, 3 full months since Jay Powell's great flood. So if there's all this massive money printing, then, shouldn't it be showing up somewhere? Not just the stock market, and it's not really showing up in the stock market, at least not directly. So, again, we're right back at what we talked about before, where the Fed is trying to tell you a story, but it's not a real story. It's a fiction. It's a fairy tale. It doesn't actually happen in reality. And if you actually pin down Jay Powell or anybody at the FOMC and made them answer you truthfully and honestly, they would say, well, yeah, we know that too. Our intent isn't to flood the system with money. It's just to get people to think that we are, so they act like we are. And therefore, they're trying to get you and me to act inflationary, and that will be where the inflation comes from. But again, it's not really possible.
I've got one more wonkish inflationary question before maybe we broaden it out to the US dollar and the bigger picture. But there's something called the flexible price CPI, which I had never heard of. And you said that it's been negative for 4 consecutive months. Is that even crazier than core CPI? And how far back does this data series go?
The flexible CPI, I believe, goes back into the 60s. And there's actually something, its twin companion is called the sticky CPI. What some researchers did was they tried to figure out, okay, you think flexible, aren't all prices flexible? Well, no. Sometimes you can change prices for certain products much, much faster than you can for others. Some prices, companies, they have to leave them at the same price for months or even years at a time. And so what the researchers did is they tried to put all of the prices that can change very rapidly at a moment's notice in a bucket to kind of get a sense of what the economy was doing at that particular time, and how people who are able to act upon their immediate perceptions, what they're actually doing. And so if you look at the flexible CPI over the last 4 months, what companies who have the best ability to change prices in a very short-term situation, or very, change prices as much as they possibly can, prices have been falling for 4 straight months, including prices in June. So that's indicative of further discounting going on now, which is a deflationary type of pressure, not an inflationary one. So it's not a big signal. It's not a dispositive clue or anything like that, but it is another kind of signal that what we're seeing isn't the product of this massive biblical monetary flood.
Another signal is the dollar. And you say, quote, the CPI, like the dollar, indicates that Powell was saved by the reopening rather than the common narrative that the Fed saved the world until reopening. What is the dollar corroborating?
Well, if you can look at the dollar, and we use the dollar index, for example, and there's many different dollar indexes. I prefer the trade-weighted index because I think that's more closely aligned with how the system actually works. I think the main dollar index, DXY, that's good enough, but that you got to remember with DXY, it's influenced mostly by the yen and the euro. But we look at the dollar, it's, the global financial crisis #2 is pretty obvious. It was a massive dollar spike, this huge short squeeze because of the dollar shortage, the monetary destruction that we've been talking about, the leaky bucket. There it is. There's the leaks in the bucket right in front of you. But ever since Jay Powell's massive flood, when he panicked and did all this QE stuff and all these other kinds of rescues and these acronyms all over the place, dollar swaps, whatever it was, ever since that point, that's supposedly been the flood, this inflationary flood we're supposed to pay attention to. And yet the dollar, after the initial crisis period, kind of stuck around at a really elevated rate, which kind of says, wait a minute. If Jay Powell is flooding the world with liquidity, as he said on 60 Minutes, yes, we did a flood. Why isn't the dollar responding to that addition of liquidity across global markets? In fact, it didn't actually start to come back down until the middle of May, which is a pretty important time period, because what else happened in the middle of May? It wasn't that the monetary flood from the Federal Reserve suddenly showed up. It was, as we look at jobless claims, middle of May, that was when the economy, the U.S. economy and other economies around the world, but the U.S. economy in particular, began to reopen. And so that's what I was saying, is that here we have the dollar saying, wait a minute, bank reserves are going up at the same time the dollar is going up and staying up, which is not what we would expect with a flood of liquidity. Instead, the dollar only comes down when the economy is reopened. So Powell was saved by reopening, not Powell saving the economy until reopening.
Jeff, last question on this article. I read your work. I have been for a long time. And since the crisis began, I would say that this article is your most explicit, that your interpretation, and that's not utterly explicit, but it's just the one that stands out the most, that your interpretation of the monetary data and the economic accounts it suggests that you feel that May and June, in some undefined period immediately in front of us, will, in retrospect, be seen as a reprieve and not as a resolution of what we experience in March. Is that right? Are you feeling, a couple months in now, that this it's not going to hold the recovery?
Yeah, I think I've definitely explained it this way through the labor market statistics, is that there's really two groups in the labor market, two groups of unemployed, and you can think about it in the broader economy in the same way. There's kind of two different processes, or two different things, or two different underlying conditions. What we're seeing in over the last couple months is that the shutdown and reopening has dominated the headlines and dominated the big statistics, which has given us some of these most, record highs, record big, massive positives in whatever various economic accounts. It was retail sales in the U.S. a couple months ago. You see it across Europe. You see it across a lot of different places where these gigantic positives. And it sounds like, hey, the economy is roaring back to life. When in fact, when you look at it as a whole, when you start to factor this other part of the economy, the one that isn't necessarily related to the shutdown and reopening, it's okay. Once the reopening happens, once it gets through the vast majority of its process and things are back to almost completely reopened again, then what happens? That's when I think we'll start to see the economic damage start to come up, not just in the statistics, but in how we actually behave and how the economy behaves. And that, yeah, once we get through this window of gigantic positives, on the other side of it, it might not look the way that people are expecting when they're looking at only those gigantic positives, which are in some ways misleading.
Well, for the audience, if you're enjoying this show and you're watching it on YouTube, you can also get it as a podcast, and you can download them from Apple, iHeart, Castro, TuneIn, Google, Spotify, Castbox, Breaker, Podbean. If I worked out more, I'd be able to do it all in one breath. Stitcher, Overcast, Pocket Cast, and Podcast Addict.